Professor Patsy Rodenburg is a world-renowned voice teacher and coach based in the United Kingdom. With over 4 decades of expertise, Professor Rodenburg has transformed countless lives through her mastery in restoring authentic voice and presence. Welcome to the Persuasive Mindset, your podcast guide to mastering the art of persuasion by exploring its role across diverse fields through a series of expert interviews. I am your host, Dr. Serena Matte de Londra. In our first episode, we're inspired by Professor Rodenburg as she shares insights from her latest book, The Woman's Voice, and offers advice for aspiring professionals. This conversation is part 1 of a 2-part series. Be sure to stay tuned for the continuation of our discussion in episode 2. But first, let's listen to a quote regarding persuasion.
For thousands of years, women's voices have been stifled, or they have been told to not be authentic. Now, a very good thing in persuasion is that you have to have authenticity and authority. So women, for thousands of years, in order to survive, and there's no blame because you have to survive, they've often had to mask their power.
Now, let's dive into our conversation with Professor Rodenburg. Enjoy! Thank you for taking part in the Persuasive Discourse interview series. In your latest book, called The Woman's Voice, you mention, and I quote, "There are an abundance of stories that analyze a man's resilience and resistance in overcoming outrageous fortune, but there are too few about women. Maybe the world doesn't expect women to recover from such impacts." End quote. I'm curious to know what is the relevance of utilizing this quote in your book, and where does persuasion appear within the overall context of women's voices?
Well, the quote is actually from Hamlet, and it's about we watch a man struggle with finding out who he is, which is fundamentally a coward and he can't do something. And I think women have those stories so deeply embedded in them, but very few people have written about it, a woman overcoming. In fact, most of the time when I work with world leaders, women in corporations and actually politics, they are much more, in a strange way, wounded. They're really good at their job because they have had to struggle to be heard. Still, you go into corporations or schools or anywhere, and the women know a lot more than the men. But more importantly, and this is why the woman's voice is so important on the planet, is that actually, without any blame to men, the struggle that women have has filled them somehow with compassion and a sort of level of humanity. So I think for thousands of years, women's voices have been stifled, or they have been told to not be authentic. Now, a very good thing in persuasion is that you have to have authenticity and authority. So women, for thousands of years, in order to survive, and there's no blame because you have to survive, they've often had to mask their power. A lot of women are very prone to wanting to be liked as opposed to, being themselves and saying what they mean. And so this outrageous fortune that when women have got into leadership roles, and I have no scientific evidence, it's just 50 years of experience, my God, they've had to work harder on themselves and their voice. It's been a harder job, and yet nobody seems to recognize that. I'm working with a woman at the moment who is so brilliant. She's taken over a huge law firm. All of the people around her are men and have absolutely tried to stop her every which way. So the struggle is there, but nobody recognizes the struggle that women have, I think.
In the same book, in chapter 16, you also describe how learning about women's stories who have found their voices has always fascinated you. And since you have always seen such great meaning in the topic of a woman's voice, I'd like to ask what actually persuaded you to write this book at this moment in time and not earlier in your career.
Well, I didn't think that what was happening. I have a nearly written book called The Bard in the Boardroom, which is about Shakespeare and his understanding of power and strategy. And in lockdown, I thought that I would finish that book. But instead, and this sounds insane, but it's the truth, the ghost of my mother and my grandmother came into the space. And I realized that these two remarkable women, working class women, much more intelligent than my father, had been profoundly stifled. Both of them had opportunities to get a very good education from the working classes, but their fathers stopped them. And it just sort of broke my heart. And I knew, you know, that thing when you know something in your head but not in your heart. I knew that in my head, but it seemed that their energy came into me and said, write about us. So I started to write about them. And they were so overlooked, and everybody has attributed my career to it must have been the influence of your father. Well, there was an influence, but it wasn't one of profound interest in storytelling and poetry and fairness. You know, I've been driven most of my life by a sense of what is not fair and what is fair. And as a child, for whatever reason, my father was profoundly damaged by the Second World War, but he was unfair to the women, and I couldn't bear it. I could see it. So that's why I wrote about them. And I was really just doing a very, I think, very good book, but I haven't finished it yet, on how much aid Shakespeare, the understanding of Shakespeare, can be given to any leader, because he talks about power, the misuse of power, the underuse of power, all the fundamentals. He talks about love, the power of love. So I was writing that book, and suddenly I had to stop, and because I was called sort of by the ghost of my mother and grandmother to write about them. And that's what happened. I didn't know what was going to come out. I just started to know that I had to start writing that story. And then without knowing it, I had to talk about myself as a child, because it was as a child I felt the injustice of two very remarkable, resilient women, very intelligent, not be, their voice hadn't been given to them. And I've always been interested in Shakespeare, that the ethical center of storytelling is about fairness. And in Shakespeare, the people who are fair are often the working classes. Again and again in his plays, it's the working class person who suddenly speaks out. And women in the early feminist movement, they had that passion to speak out. And then in the 80s, it became cosmetic power, not spiritual and storytelling power. And that sort of was upsetting for me. I think it's come full circle. The young women I meet today are quite remarkable. There's hope.
Thank you for this clarification. I'd like to continue with another question linked to the book, and particularly in chapter 8, you write the following, and I quote: My mother wanted to learn, and my nana wanted to teach. I wanted to teach because I wanted to learn. You learn very deeply when you teach. My nana's lost teaching vocation and my mother's lost education bedded into me and circulated in my blood. It was unfair and had to be balanced. I had to find the doors that had been closed to them by their fathers. Their fathers, who maybe through protection or maybe through envy, had blocked their way. And then their husbands. Nana resisted hers and mother didn't. I know this now, I didn't then. But I did know that if they had been boys, their fathers would have burst with pride. End quote. May I please ask you to elaborate on the idea behind this quote?
The craft of teaching is a very honourable craft. I don't think anyone talks about it enough. I think to teach well, you've got to work very hard all the time. Students say to me after 50 years, you don't prepare for class, and you've been teaching these exercises, but you never teach exactly the same exercise. You develop, and then after the class you think about it. It's a relentless pursuit in my mind, the pursuit of education. And let's just remind ourselves, the word education means to lead forth. We shouldn't be stuffing information in. I mean, in my work, I believe that the vast majority of people have the most amazing voice. I believe that the vast majority of people have been born fully present. And so it's drawing forth your voice and finding your full power, because women's voices are as powerful as men's. There are differences, but not really in the end. And so you're leading something forth. And I suppose when you find something difficult, and I've always found speaking difficult, it's your fear that drives you into a place of knowledge. You have to look at something. And what I think I found so difficult as a child was that what I would call chit chat, being sociable, having sort of conversations that didn't matter. I mean, gossip is important, but I wasn't a great gossiper, and I'm not. I'm fundamentally very shy. I wanted to talk about important things. And in the 50s, women weren't supposed to talk about important things. We weren't really supposed to have a political opinion or chip in and say, I don't think that's true. So, and I knew my mother and grandmother had opinions, but they were private opinions. They couldn't be public. So I think understanding and feeling their loss, I suppose, I knew that I had to struggle through my own issues, and you still struggle. I mean, you don't. It's a road you never get to the end of until you die, probably. But you want to teach better every day. And by teaching well, you learn. I've never taught somebody that hasn't taught me something. It's a two-way exchange. It's fantastic what you learn. What I know. My brain is full of really seemingly useless information, but I've got all that because I'm very curious. I, I talk to everyone. I find, but I don't want to talk. That's my problem. I want to have a conversation that matters and a story that matters. And I think that is still that seriousness. I've heard male teachers say to me, well, you're too serious. And I have a saying that I say to lots of people I teach: we only experience joy when we take everything that's important seriously. You have to have gravitas in order to have joy. And women are supposed to laugh at things, often that jokes against them. I couldn't bear my father's. He decided very early in my life that I hadn't a sense of humour. Not I have a sense of humour, but the jokes were always to belittle my mother, to belittle my grandmother, to belittle me. And that's not funny. And still in the workplace today, in teaching, you'll hear young men and older men say that woman hasn't got a sense of humour. And you say, well, they do, but you expect them to laugh at themselves. You're expecting them to find your nasty comments funny, the banter funny. So I have to protect women in that way. And to a certain extent, I try to have to protect my mother and my grandmother. And my brother reminded me that I'd forgotten, I didn't put into the book, that one of my father's jokes about my grandmother was he would say to his male friends, "She's our washing up machine." And that was a joke, and everyone laughed. And I remember her just walking out the room, and she's our washing up machine. And I suppose we hadn't got a washing up machine because it was probably too expensive, whether they had even invented them. I think probably there were washing up machines. But there she was in the kitchen washing up in her 80s. And I still think well, I think it's degrading that you still talk to women leaders who are asked, as the tea comes in, to pour the tea. And you can be generous and you can be kind, but it's a given that I still have male friends who, when I cook a meal, will clear up, and male friends who will just sit there waiting for the woman, even though the women in the room are the people who have made the meal, but also are as important as you. And I do this course in Portugal with wonderful people, but we all eat together at lunch. And generally, some men get up to help, but at some point I watch, they're all equal, they're all training to do my work. And at some point, I watch some woman saying to some guy, "You should start clearing up." And if you get into a room with me, it's wonderful and very difficult. It's not easy all the time because I learned very early in my teaching, because I started to teach in very dangerous places like prisons, very, very tough schools, that the only way you have to lead, and women are very bad at this, so I just have to talk about it. You have to stop anything that's going on in the room that is unsafe sooner rather than later. You have to stop it. And that might mean saying to the very unpleasant guy there who's a bully and a snide, mocker, as soon as they do it, you have to say, "What are you doing over there? I don't want that." So this is a constant thing that you have to hold. But I had a group, very sophisticated women, a top lawyer in one of the biggest in Europe. And she got up to tell a wonderful story. And not in my presence, but one of the men there, but I heard him later, he laughed at her story in the most demeaning way. And I caught him and he went, "Oh," and I said, "It's not appropriate. She's just bared her soul. And you knew not to do it in front of me, but behind my back, you still couldn't help putting her down." Now, there are fantastic, I think that this is where we are at the moment. I think there are a lot more enlightened men who want to help women, but the backlash is very high level. I think some men are furious about women's power and consequently their voices being heard. And as you know from the book, I don't think we have a chance to save the planet until women speak out.
I'd like to now shift our conversation towards your overall body of work. And in the same book, you also mentioned that you chose to change the terminology from denial, state of readiness, and bluff to first circle, second circle, and the third circle of energy. And I'm very curious to learn, in retrospect, how do you believe that your work has developed over time?
It's changing, it's relentless, I'm afraid. I mean, actors sometimes say to me, "God, you're relentless." And I said, "Well, I'm relentless with myself." I mean, it's not nasty, it's resilience, but it's also growing. I started this years ago, and I'm just discovering more and more about it. And I thought that it was clearer. It opened more options, that it was just first, second, third. What we want to be in is our full authority and presence, which is what I call second circle. But I used to call it a state of readiness because and curiosity and openness. And, you often feel it when you're walking on rough ground because the body can center and you're looking around at the trees and you feel connected. And when I'm in second circle, I go out to the world and I let the world come in. I breathe in and I gather the world. I breathe out, I go out to the world. It's as simple as that. But it isn't. But we're all born with it, just about. And then it's taken away from us. And this is a huge, huge generalization, so please forgive. First circle I used to call denial, because in your body and your breath and your voice and your physical impact on the world is about pulling back. So I might be standing back on my heels, my shoulders might be rounded, I might be pulling energy in so that when I speak I sound pessimistic, and he just falls away. Hi, how are you? So that it's pulled in. I used to call it denial, as you said, but now I call it first circle. And that is generally perceived as a female energy. It's a huge generalization. So one of the things I say to people, we know before you speak whether you have impact, whether you're to be noticed. So if you go to the theatre and the curtain goes up and the actor is standing with their feet together and looking down, before they speak, you think to yourself, so it might, and if an actor can't do that and they're trying to be a warrior, then there's a problem in their physicality, that's what's reading a warrior. When I'm in second circle, I look out at the audience, I make eye contact. Impact is you have to come out to people and you have to receive them. It's give and take. First circle might be fantastic listeners. They're taking it all in, but you never know what they think. And that's because they've been shy. I'm not blaming anyone. There's no blame. So second circle is where we want to be, which is this circle of energy that you are looking around and you're taking things in. You notice the bird in the tree, you notice, and you're also going out. And that's I think, our natural state. I don't think you can cross the Kalahari as we did. We walked out of Africa without being in that presence, because we would have been eaten by lions. But it's also walking, we're sort of naive, aren't we? We walk at night with listening to our earphone music. I would suggest that that's not wise. So, because technology is closing us down. We thought that technology would open up communication, and in many ways it has, but it's now closing us down. So people are sitting beside a computer and they're pulling in and their head is coming, and that affects the voice diminishes, all that. So the first circle. Third circle, I've talked about bluff. I used to call it bluff, but that is command and control. And most bullies I've come across are third circle. They speak out, they speak at you, they don't ever want you to answer them back. Now, these are, again, generalizations. But that also means, and I think the weakness in first and third, people think the third is power. It isn't power, it's force. So I give out, but I never receive. I never receive somebody's story. I never receive their energy. I never receive. I take an idea from them and I never say, that's a fantastic idea, but then I use it the next day in the board meeting. It's all that. But they're also weakened because they're desensitized to the world. The man who I talked about in this bank was third circle. Doesn't mean to say they're bad people. They've often been trained to do that, but it's cosmetic power. It's force. So as soon as they started to, at first, he couldn't figure out apparently why they were stepping back, and then he did, because bluff is a shield. Great people are vulnerable. Power has to have vulnerability. And you cannot, and this is so important, you cannot build a group until everyone is present and everyone is accepting each other and breathing to the group and listening to the group and not cutting off from the group, not absenting themselves from the group. You have to be in the group. And that doesn't mean it's all lovey-dovey. This is all misunderstood. A community, a group, a team, you're working together, you're in service to something. In acting, you're in service to the play and the audience, you're in service. It doesn't mean to say you like everyone. That's sort of naive. I mean, that's all the problems with bad teaching often, is that everyone has to like you. No. It's impossible to stand in front of 24 people and all of them like you. It's impossible. This idea of perfection is impossible. What are we telling young people, that perfection exists? It's madness. And no wonder they're upset, because how can you be perfect? Well, most people think of persuasion as force, and you speak at somebody, you interrupt them, you shout. That's weak. Nobody's listening. And this idea of second circle is the same idea that you have to stay open, breathe to each other, listen to each other. It's give and take, it's balance. If you're going to have a discussion with somebody, you have to say, I have to listen, but the critical thing you have to say, which third circle people can't until they drop away from third circle. It's all possible. Transformation is possible, you know? I am right and you are wrong. There's a tyranny in certainty. There's a tyranny in certainty, because you have to admit that you could be wrong. I could be wrong. I might be with somebody and I disagree with most of the things they say, but then they tell a story about themselves and I see a bit of compassion in there and I get interested. And then you find out something that you can latch onto. You can agree on something. You can agree. There's a journalist on television that most people cannot bear because he's pretty obnoxious. But I thought, well, he does agree with gun control in America. Maybe we can build a bridge there. And the only way out is in second circle, that I give and take, and you listen to someone, and you don't think that anyone is not worth listening to. By the way, the only reason people say to me, oh, you know a lot of this and about that, and I don't. I said, well, I only just talk to people. Everybody I meet, everybody you meet has got they know something that you don't. They know something you don't. And what a joy life is if you think you're talking to a taxi driver and they say, well, I do, you know, I love playing this, you know, I coach a team of rugby team. And you say, what? So how do you, well, I do it because, you know, I always wanted to be a rugby. You find out something and then they'll tell you something that you don't know. This exchange of information through storytelling and just questioning people with kindness and generosity, you find out I had to say something to a student about a year ago, and he's very talented, but he's very destructive. And by the way, I talk about you can be difficult but not destructive. I don't mind difficult people as long as they will listen. And I just said to him, you know, that the group he's a very opinionated, but also he is incredibly talented, but he doesn't respect anyone else in the group. And the group did some very good work, and everyone was very pleased. And he said, I thought it was crap. And I said, oh, why? And he couldn't really give an explanation. And then the group got very angry with him. He said, it wasn't crap. We did some good work. And I had a colleague there who I'd taught for about 30 years, and she'd been in theatre. And I said his name, and I said, you know, whenever I come in to the room, you're doing some martial arts, and I don't like that because it's bad. So I've often talked to you about your martial arts, and I do know martial artists and work with them, but you taught me a lot about your martial arts, didn't you? And he said, yeah, I did. I said, good, because you know more than I do. I know I've done some taekwondo, I've done some tai chi, I've done some judo, but you know more than I do. He said, yeah, I know that. And I said, you taught me a lot about that. And he said, yeah, I think I did. And I said, you know, between my colleague, my associate teacher, and myself, we've got 80 years of experience. Why wouldn't you listen to us in the way that I listened to you when I knew that you knew something? And I went away from that conversation and I thought, oh, that's really interesting. I never thought about that. I never thought about that. And that's what we have to do with each other. We have to find the bits that we don't know and we learn. And that is what community is. So when a community is well led, the leader doesn't do much work in the end. They sit back and they only intervene. It's rather like with alpha male, alpha female bonobos. They only intervene when it goes. So the group will discipline itself. And let's use the word discipline properly. All discipline means it comes from disciple. You're on a journey, you know, even if it's the journey to find out as much as you can about, you know, quantum physics. It's just that you want to find something out. And that's what we have to do with each other. Find things out.
Your body of work includes several outstanding books, and I'm very eager to learn about your creative process. Can you please share some insights into how you approach your writing?
I write by hand and I write speaking every word out aloud as I write it. And then it's my voice. A lot of playwrights know that. I mean, I might not be able to loud, but people who watch me on the kitchen table writing, my mouth is going. I'm mouthing it. I'm feeling the words. I'm feeling the rhythm. And then when I edit it, I'm just reading it out aloud and fiddling with it in that way. So it's very, but you can't do it unless you have passion. You have to care about what you, sorry, passion. Yes, you've got to think it matters. I mean, we can all have a lovely read of something glib and funny, but we forget. But I can't I can't do anything that I don't feel I study deeply. I know what I know. I continually learn more. I mean, my late husband at least had this view, but at one point I was very early in my career. I was on, at the time, about 3,200 a year, working everywhere, learning my craft. And I was working with somebody who is now right at the top of the pop world, a doyen of the top. And she saw my potential. I worked with her. And she said, come and work with me. And it was an extraordinary sum of money she offered me in 1970 something. It was like 60,000 a year. And out of my mouth came, oh, but I don't know enough. And thank God, John, my late husband, had the same view. And I went home. We didn't have money. I never thought I'd make money. I never went into this to make money. And I said, this has been offered to me, and I'd go and work with pop stars and all that. And he said, you don't know enough. And I said, yes, that's right. You've got to knock on your heart sometimes and think, do I really know something? And I'm always prepared to admit when I don't know. But you have to know something. You know, there's a lot of teaching and coaching that is just based on cosmetic stuff, which is great maybe, and a lot of people don't want stuff that changes them. I have students who'd much rather lie on the floor not doing any work. But that's not what I can do, because there are always students who want to seek to excel. And we need really good leaders. not people who go, as we heard with the lockdown and the government here, not knowing anything about what they were doing. I mean, this is tragic, not having people around them that know or listening to them. It's got very unfashionable to know something deeply. I think it's changing, and you're mocked. I don't care. I've been mocked all my life. But, God, she's so passionate about it. Well, that's the way I am. And I don't want to live another way.
What are your views on teaching people who have very different backgrounds from one another?
When I started as a voice teacher, people would say, other voice teachers, what do you mean you just teach ordinary people? And I said, well, that's interesting. I'm out of my depth a lot of the time. But I couldn't have written The Right to Speak if I hadn't got all these. I used to put down the phone thinking, oh no, what have I said yes to? But then you learn. It's Chaucer who says the life so short, the craft so long to learn. We're on if you want to do something well, and we need people who communicate better, truthfully, authentically.
I completely agree with you on the need to teach diverse people. And as we now approach the end of the first part of our conversation, I'd very much like to ask you to please take a moment to look at your overall career and from that angle to share some advice with those listeners who are fascinated by your career track and would like to do something similar.
Go out and try things. Go out and, I mean, it's very hard to say this, but I learned a lot doing jobs that didn't pay much. Everybody that I teachers, not everybody, but a lot wants to do all the, the big corporate stuff where they can earn, sometimes eye-watering amounts of money. I think you've just got to put your focus on the work, not on what it gets you. It's like students saying, I want an Oscar. Well, you'll probably get an Oscar if you just do the work. And sometimes, actors come into my workshops, that they're in town, they're either in New York or wherever, and they come in and they join in a bit, and then I say, bye, off you go. And I'll say, do you know who that person was? And most of them say no. I said, well, they've got an Oscar. And you don't even know. Who won the Oscar 10 years ago for Best Actor? So why is it so important? We're dangling something which is cosmetic. Of course it's lovely to get an Oscar, but it's the work that matters. Because if you do the work correctly, you are changing people, the audience, particularly when you're fully present and particularly in theatre. There's a story, this happens to so many actors. If you do the work, and often in theatre you're not earning a lot of money, but you will be standing on a subway or, underground station and somebody will come up and say, I saw you play that role 20 years ago. And you've forgotten the role. Oh, yes, I did. Yeah, that was, yes, I did that on Broadway, didn't I? Yes. And it's changed them. And that's worth doing, because a great, well-told story transforms. It awakens and transforms. Not all the audience all the time. You might have to look at it 10 times before you go, oh, it might be 10 years down the line. Then you go, that play touched me, but so we're doing something, storytelling and good communication. And we now know that in the corporate world, we do work, we want to do business with people who listen and tell us stories. So you have all these people who know every bit of data. They can spout data. But actually, bring your humanity in, and you get more connection to most clients. Not all, but most.
And that concludes the first part of my conversation with Professor Rodenburg, which was recorded on the 24th of November 2023. But before we wrap up, I want to extend a special thank you to Ignatius Calabria for creating the wonderful music you've heard throughout this episode. And if you enjoyed this conversation with Professor Rodenburg, make sure to listen to the second part of our discussion in episode 2. There, we'll delve even deeper into her remarkable insights and explore more about her overall work. Thank you for listening, and be well.